Hi there, I'm Michelle and welcome back to the Canadian History, a Chronology channel. Today's episode, number 15, brings us back to New France. At this point in history, the Huron Confederacy has fallen, beaten into submission and scattered by the Iroquois. So now, the coureurs de bois, the French-Canadian woodsmen, had to act as fur trade middlemen. This, of course, angered the Iroquois. And it's important to note at this time that the Iroquois outnumbered the French military by far, so attacks began again. So in 1660, the French decided to go on the offensive against the Iroquois. A small force of 17 Frenchmen, led by Adam Dollard des Ormeaux, joined by a larger group of Hurons and a handful of Algonquins, was put together. Their target would be the Iroquois trade canoes. Unfortunately, the group ran into a full invasion force of 300 plus Iroquois who were on their way to Montreal. Dollard and his group took refuge in an abandoned stockade in Long-Sault as the battle raged for 7 days. At the end of the battle, Dollard's native allies abandoned the stockade, leaving only 9 French defenders to fight off the Iroquois. Eventually, though, the Iroquois overran the stockade, killing several of the survivors and carried off others for ritual torture. Although Dollard died in the battle, he's recognized as having stopped the full-scale invasion of Montreal. At this time in 1660, New France only had about 3,000 colonists living there. In comparison, the English had 100,000 or more on the eastern seaboard of Canada. To correct the imbalance, the French king, Louis XIV, cancelled the Company of 100 Associates and remade New France as a royal province under the direct authority of the king himself. So now the colony of New France was ruled by royal decree, and within 10 years, the colony more than doubled in size. Initially, the colony of New France's economy was based on mercantilism. Mercantilism is based on the concept that trade is a zero-sum business, that wealth is finite, meaning that the pie can only be cut so many ways, and more for you means less for me. At this time, this was how imperialism worked. It meant that colonies were meant to be exploited by the mother country. It meant that colonies should not cost more to administer and defend than the value of goods they supplied. Basically, mercantilism was not meant to increase the standard of living or the infrastructure of the colony, but to amass as much wealth from the colony as possible. A strong believer and supporter of mercantilism was King Louis XIV's chief advisor, Jean-Baptiste Colbert. He developed a self-supporting system of triangular trade between France and its colonies in Canada and in the Caribbean. Basically, it worked like this. The French-Canadian colonies would provide furs, fish, timber, and minerals. The Caribbean colonies would provide rum, molasses, and sugar. And in return, France would provide the colonies with textiles and manufactured goods. So now the French-Canadian colonies became a major part of the French Grand Imperial plans. This now required an administrator, and the French called this person the intendant. The first intendant of New France was Jean Talon. He was a new kind of person. He was not an explorer, not a soldier, not a martyr. He was a bureaucrat. Jean Talon arrived in 1665 and served 2 terms totaling 6 years, returning to France in 1672. He transformed New France. He built the colony's first shipyard. He imported livestock. He established new communities. He imported looms for weaving their own textiles. He even created Canada's first family allowance and ensured that landowners actually lived on the lands they owned. Jean Talon even went further. He encouraged shops, inns, and factories to be set up and built the first commercial brewery in 1668. He also arranged for hundreds of young women to immigrate to New France. At the same time, in 1665, King Louis XIV had enough of the dominant Iroquois. Something had to be done. So he sent 1,100 soldiers to the colony to deal with the Iroquois. They marched against the Iroquois, burnt a few villages, and set up garrisons at Montreal and Trois-Rivières. The soldiers only stayed in New France for 3 years, leaving about 400 soldiers behind, but their presence had a lasting impact. Then in 1667, the Iroquois agreed to a ceasefire that would last for nearly 20 years. And this ceasefire allowed New France to flourish. They built cathedrals and large homes. Land was cleared and farms were built. And as I already mentioned, Jean Talon also arranged for women to immigrate to the colony. After taking the colony's first census, Talon came to know that in a population of 3,200 colonists, there were 720 bachelors and only 45 single females. Population growth was stalled. Between 1663 and 1673, at Talon's urging, King Louis XIV sponsored nearly 800 young female settlers. These women became known as les filles du roi, daughters of the king. Their transportation and settlement costs were covered by the king, and most married very quickly. The population of the colony exploded. And as an interesting side note, most of the 6 million Quebecois living in Quebec today can trace their ancestry back to these brave women. Some of the men, though, did not want to get married. They were enjoying the free life of a bachelor in the colony. So Jean Talon issued a new order. In a letter to Jean-Baptiste Colbert, King Louis XIV's chief advisor, Talon wrote, quote, "I have ordered that bachelors be deprived of the right to trade and hunt, that honors and privileges of church and community be withheld, other than by decree, if within 15 days of the arrival of the vessels from France, they are still not married." End quote. Funny thing, though, is that Jean Talon himself was never married. That's the old do as I say, not as I do system. For land ownership, Jean Talon reinforced the old feudal system of land ownership in New France that was originally introduced in the 1620s. This system was called the seigneurial system. It was first devised by Cardinal Richelieu, but strengthened by Jean Talon. Basically, an estate belonged to a seigneur, or lord, on the condition that he develop it. The land itself was a long stretch of narrow land that ran to the river, giving each landowner access to the river. A requirement was for the seigneur to build a manor, a mill, and sometimes even a fortress. The seigneurs brought in laborers who worked the land, but not fully own it, and had to give back to the seigneur a portion of their harvest. Whether or not this was a good system is up for debate, but it did seem to stall expansion somewhat, especially when compared to the English colonies that rewarded expansion. Growth was slower in New France than in the English colonies. A very important point at this time to make was that the New France colonists no longer saw themselves as either French or European, but rather as Canadiens. Well, that's it for the short history of our trip back to New France. Please stay tuned for the next episode, episode 16, The Fur Wars. Now remember, at any time, feel free to leave comments or questions below, and I'll do my best to respond to them all. And please, be a true Canadian and be polite. And if you like this content, please subscribe to my channel and give it a thumbs up. And hit the bell if you'd like to be notified of any new content. Thanks everyone, and have a great day.